I learned that night that some men don't need to raise their voices to change the direction of your life. By 11:40 p.m., my feet were throbbing so badly I could feel my pulse in my arches, and the silver tray balanced in my hands had started to feel like it weighed 50 pounds instead of 5. The Vale estate looked like something out of an old money magazine spread, all marble floors, towering floral arrangements, and chandeliers so bright they made every flaw feel visible. I was 24, working a private catering shift I'd picked up last minute because my rent was due in 6 days, and my landlord had already left me 2 voicemails that sounded more like warnings than reminders. I was supposed to blend in, refill glasses, clear plates, keep my head down. Instead, I ended up crying in the pantry like a girl who still hadn't learned that rich people could smell weakness from across a room. It had started with a spilled drink. That was all. One careless turn, one elbow in a crowded service corridor, one splash of champagne across a woman's pale designer silk dress. She looked at me like I had personally insulted her bloodline. Her smile never changed, but her eyes did. Cold, sharp, amused. "Do they hire anyone now?" she asked, loud enough for the people around her to hear. A few of them laughed the way wealthy people laugh when they don't want to seem cruel, only entertained. I apologized twice, maybe 3 times. My face burned so hot I thought I might faint right there under the chandelier. But she stepped closer anyway, lowering her voice just enough to make it worse. "You should be grateful you're allowed in a place like this at all." I nodded because I needed the job more than I needed my pride, and because humiliation in public has a way of shrinking your spine by inches. I made it through the next 10 minutes on instinct alone. Smile, walk, serve, breathe. Then I slipped into the pantry, shut the door behind me, and pressed both hands against the metal shelf just to stay upright. The room smelled like coffee grounds, lemons, and pressed linen. My chest hurt from the effort of holding myself together. I kept telling myself not to cry because mascara could be fixed, but swollen eyes were harder to hide. That was when the door opened. I didn't turn right away. I just froze, one hand at my mouth, the other still gripping the shelf. I expected another server. Maybe the event manager coming to tell me to get back out there. Instead, a man's voice, deep and controlled, cut through the silence like a blade wrapped in velvet. "Who made you cry in my house?" I looked up so fast I forgot to breathe. Adrian Vale stood in the doorway, one hand still resting on the brass handle, black suit immaculate, shoulders broad enough to block out the light from the hall. I knew who he was the way everyone in Manhattan knew who he was. Not from magazines. Not exactly. More from whispers. From the way important men lowered their voices when his name came up. From the way staff had been warned all evening not to speak to him unless spoken to first. He didn't look angry. That would have been easier. He looked calm. And somehow that was worse. His gray eyes dropped to the cracked lipstick stain on my thumb, then lifted back to my face. "I asked you a question, Claire." My stomach dropped. I had never told him my name. "No one," I whispered, even though both of us knew I was lying. Adrian stepped inside and closed the door behind him with a soft click that sounded louder than applause. "Try again," he said, and the room suddenly felt too small for my heartbeat. My throat tightened around the answer. But Adrian Vale was still standing there waiting, and something in his expression told me silence would count as its own kind of confession. I wiped quickly at my face with the heel of my hand and tried to straighten my spine. "It was nothing," I said. "Just a misunderstanding." His gaze did not soften. If anything, it became more focused, the way a storm looks right before it breaks over the water. He took one step closer, and I caught the clean scent of cedar and expensive cologne. Something dark and restrained that did not belong anywhere near industrial shelves and bulk paper towels. "People do not usually cry in my pantry over misunderstandings," he said. His voice stayed low, perfectly even, but I felt every word land like weight against my ribs. I should have looked away. I knew that. Men like Adrian Vale were not part of my world. They were the kind of men other people adjusted themselves around. But I had already had one humiliating scene that night, and I could not survive another one with my dignity intact, so I lifted my chin and forced myself to meet his eyes. "I spilled champagne on a guest," I said. She was upset. I should not have been clumsy. His jaw shifted once. Barely. A tiny movement, but it changed the whole room. "Who?" he asked. I gave a nervous laugh that sounded thin even to me. "It does not matter." "Claire." The way he said my name made it feel less like a word and more like a line drawn in ink. Who? My fingers tightened around the edge of the shelf. Somewhere beyond the pantry door, the party continued in a wash of muted music and crystal and polished conversation. But in that small room, it felt like the entire night had narrowed down to one impossible choice. Protect myself by saying nothing, or tell the truth to a man who looked like truth had never once failed to obey him. A woman in silver, I said at last, hating how small my voice sounded. I do not know her name. Adrian held my stare for another second, then nodded once as if I had confirmed something he already suspected. You work for Hawthorne Catering? Yes. How long? Almost 11 months. And in 11 months, has anyone here ever had a reason to complain about your work? I blinked at him. No, then I do not think this was about champagne. The words should have comforted me. Instead, they made my eyes sting all over again because they were the first kind thing anyone had said to me that night, and kindness, when you are barely holding yourself together, can be more dangerous than cruelty. I looked down before he could see how close I was to crying again. I can handle it, I whispered. I am sure you can, he said. That is not what I asked. Before I could answer, he reached past me, slow enough that I had time to flinch, and pulled a folded white linen towel from the shelf. He held it out. I stared at it for half a second before taking it from him. The fabric was cool and crisp in my shaking hands. Thank you, I said. Look at me. I do not know why I obeyed. Maybe because he was used to being obeyed. Maybe because beneath all that control, there was something in his face that did not look cold anymore. It looked furious on my behalf, and that was so unexpected it left me unsteady. His eyes moved over my face, not invasive, not lingering, just careful, as if he were memorizing the damage humiliation leaves behind even when no one lays a hand on you. You are done for the night, he said. No, the answer came out too fast. I cannot be done. If I leave early, I might lose future shifts. You will not lose anything. You cannot know that. One corner of his mouth shifted, but it was not a smile. Claire, he said quietly, I know exactly what happens under my roof. The silence stretched. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then someone knocked once on the pantry door. Adrian did not turn around. Yes, he said. The door opened a crack. One of the security men leaned in, dark suit, earpiece, expression blank. Sir, the Delaney party is asking for their car. Adrian's face never changed. Send it. The guard hesitated. Immediately, Adrian's eyes stayed on mine. Immediately, the door shut again. I swallowed hard. I did not know who the Delaneys were, but something told me the woman in silver would not be finishing her dessert. Adrian finally stepped back, giving me enough air to breathe again. Go upstairs, he said. There is a guest room prepared. I stared at him like he had started speaking another language. I cannot stay here. Tonight, you can. Why? His gaze dropped briefly to the towel twisted in my hands, then returned to my face. Because whoever made you cry made the mistake of doing it where I could see. I should have said no. Any sane woman would have. But sanity had started slipping somewhere between the silver dress, the pantry door, and the quiet authority in Adrian Vale's voice that made refusal feel less like a choice and more like a misunderstanding. I followed one of the house attendants up a staircase so wide my apartment could have fit across the landing twice. My black service shoes sank into runner. Carpet so thick it softened every step, and the silence on the second floor felt different from the party downstairs. Colder. More expensive. Like even noise needed permission to exist there. The woman who led me did not ask questions. She opened a door at the end of the hall, told me someone would bring tea, and left me alone in a guest suite larger than my entire studio in Queens. For a full minute, I just stood there with my hands still wrapped around that folded white towel Adrian had given me, staring at the room like it might disappear if I blinked. Everything was cream and gold and soft lamplight. Fresh flowers sat on a table near the window. A fire glowed behind glass on the far wall. My reflection in the mirror over the dresser looked like a mistake someone had carried into the wrong life. Red eyes. Smudged mascara. Catering uniform still faintly smelling like champagne and butter and panic. I set the towel down carefully on the edge of the vanity like it was worth more than my weekly paycheck and went into the bathroom. The marble counters gleamed. The shower was the size of my kitchen. Even the hand soap looked expensive. I turned on the faucet and splashed cold water over my face until my skin stopped burning. Then I braced both palms against the sink and looked at myself. Get it together, Claire, I whispered. You are here for one night. That is all. But the words did not settle right in my chest, because nothing about the night had felt temporary since Adrian stepped into that pantry and looked at me like my tears had become his problem. A soft knock came 10 minutes later. Tea, exactly like promised, along with a tray of fruit, warm bread, and soup that smelled like rosemary and cream. I had not realized how hungry I was until then. My hands shook less after the first few bites. By the time I finished half the bowl, the knot in my throat had loosened enough for exhaustion to take over where humiliation left off. I kicked off my shoes, sat on the edge of the bed, and made the mistake of looking out the window. From that height, Manhattan looked unreal. Black glass towers, strings of headlights, rain beginning again in silver streaks against the dark. Somewhere down below, in rooms I could not see, people were still talking about deals and influence and names that opened doors. Men like Adrian belonged to that world the way the rest of us belonged to gravity. I was still sitting there when voices drifted faintly from the hallway. Too muffled to make out every word, but I heard enough. She has been removed from the guest list. A pause. No, sir. The Delaney's left immediately. Then another silence, followed by a lower reply I recognized without needing to hear it clearly. Adrian. Calm. Unhurried. Final. My stomach tightened. He had done something. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a quiet rearranging of the world outside that room. And somehow I was at the center of it. I told myself that did not mean anything. Powerful men fixed problems because they liked control, not because they cared. I knew that much about the world. Still, when I finally lay down against sheets so soft they felt unreal, I could not stop replaying the way he had said my name. Not flirtatious. Not gentle. Just certain. As if Claire Bennett was not someone hired for the evening, but someone he had already decided to remember. I must have fallen asleep with that thought still tangled in my chest, because the last thing I remember before darkness took me was the strange, terrifying feeling that for the first time in months, I was not afraid of tomorrow. I was afraid of what it might ask me to become. Morning in that house did not arrive gently. It arrived in layers of pale gold through tall windows, in the hush of central air, in the distant sound of footsteps too disciplined to ever be called noise. For a few seconds, I forgot where I was. Then I opened my eyes to a ceiling with hand-painted trim and sheets that felt like water under my fingertips, and the memory of the night before came back all at once. The pantry, the woman in silver, Adrian's voice. You are done for the night. I sat up too quickly, my pulse tripping over itself, and pushed the blanket back. That was when I saw it. At first, I thought sleep was still clinging to me. A trick of light. A reflection. But no. There, on my left hand, resting against skin that suddenly did not feel like mine, was a ring. My breath caught so hard it hurt. It was not delicate. It was not subtle. A slim band of white gold, cool and severe, set with a single oval diamond framed by smaller stones that caught the morning light and broke it into sharp little flashes against the bedspread. The kind of ring women in my tax bracket did not accidentally wake up wearing. I stared at it for so long my vision blurred. Then I yanked my hand back like it had burned me. No, I whispered, to the room, to myself, to whatever madness had put it there. I searched the bed, the nightstand, the floor, as if there would be an explanation sitting somewhere obvious, folded neatly beside the lamp. There was none. Just a note on thick cream stationery propped against a silver tray I had somehow missed before. Breakfast at 9. Where the ring. The handwriting was clean, masculine, and infuriatingly calm. No signature. None needed. My hands started shaking all over again. Absolutely not. I muttered, but even alone, the words sounded weak. I threw the blankets aside, went straight to the bathroom, and tried to pull the ring off. It did not budge. I used soap, warm water, then cold. My finger only turned pinker, the stone flashing every time I twisted my hand under the light like it was enjoying the humiliation. By the time I gave up, I was breathing hard and angry at myself for feeling something even worse than anger underneath it. Panic. Because a ring like that was not jewelry. It was a statement. A message. A line drawn around my life in ink I had not agreed to. There was a garment bag hanging in the closet with my name on it. Of course there was. Inside hung a cream blouse soft as air, dark tailored slacks, and shoes in exactly my size. Not borrowed. Not improvised. Chosen. I had no idea how that unsettled me more than the ring, but it did. Someone in that house had noticed enough about me to dress me by morning. I wanted my own clothes. My own cheap shoes. My own life. Instead, 40 minutes later, I was standing outside the guest suite wearing clothing that fit me better than anything I owned, the ring hidden badly by the way I curled my hand toward my side. The hallway downstairs seemed longer in daylight. A woman near the staircase glanced at me, saw the ring, and stopped mid-step. Her entire posture changed. "Good morning, Miss Bennett," she said, with a small respectful nod. Miss Bennett. Not Claire. Not sweetheart. Not honey like men said when they wanted to remind you where you stood. The title landed strangely in my chest. Another staff member looked up from arranging flowers in a vase, saw my hand, and straightened at once. By the time I reached the breakfast room, 3 people had greeted me with the same careful courtesy, and every single one of them had looked at the ring before they looked at my face. The room itself was flooded with morning light, all polished wood and white linen and windows overlooking a terrace wet from last night's rain. Adrian was already there, seated at the head of a long table that could have hosted a board meeting or a royal family. He was reading something on a tablet, coffee untouched at his right hand, dark suit replaced by a charcoal sweater that somehow made him look even more dangerous. Less public, more real. He lifted his eyes the moment I stepped in, and I knew from one glance that none of this was an accident. His gaze moved to the ring, then back to my face. "Good morning, Claire," he said, like we were discussing weather and not the fact that I had woken up branded by a future I had never agreed to. I stopped 3 feet from the table and held up my hand. "Take it off." Adrian set the tablet down with infuriating calm. "Sit first." No, my voice came out sharper than I expected, but fear has a way of sharpening everything. "You do not get to do this to me." His expression did not change. If anything, he looked more attentive. "Then it is good," he said quietly, "that I did not do it to you. I did it for you." I stared at him across the white linen and polished silver, trying to decide which felt more dangerous, the ring on my hand or the complete certainty in his voice. "For me," I repeated, and my laugh came out thin and disbelieving. "You put a diamond on my finger while I was asleep, and you want me to believe that was a favor." Adrian leaned back slightly in his chair, one hand resting near his coffee cup, his expression composed in a way that only made my pulse climb faster. Morning light cut across one side of his face, catching the sharp line of his cheekbone and the unreadable calm in his eyes. "I want you to understand," he said, "that last night changed things. For you, maybe. Not for me. Especially for you." The words landed with that same velvet weight his voice always carried. I hated the effect it had on me, the way it made the room feel smaller, the way it made defiance feel fragile even when I meant every syllable. I stepped closer to the table and flattened my left hand against the linen as if forcing the ring into plain sight would somehow force the truth out with it. "Take it off," I said again. "Now." Adrian's gaze dropped briefly to my hand. There was no surprise there, no guilt, just a measured kind of attention, as though he had expected this exact moment and had already decided how it would end. "Sit, Claire. Stop telling me to sit." Something flashed behind his eyes then, not anger exactly, but recognition. He rose in one smooth motion, tall enough that the temperature in the room seemed to shift with him. He did not come around the table. He did not crowd me. He only stood there, hands loose at his sides, looking at me with a focus so complete it made everything else disappear. "You are upset," he said. "You should be. You woke up in a house that is not yours wearing something you did not ask for. I know that." The unexpected fairness of that answer threw me off balance more than denial would have. My fingers curled slightly against the tablecloth. "Then why are you acting like this is reasonable?" "Because the alternative was worse." "What alternative?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive. "Choosing. Last night, after you went upstairs, 3 people asked for your full name." The blood drained from my face so quickly I felt cold all at once. "What?" 2 were curious. 1 was not. His tone stayed level, but something in it sharpened under the surface. "The woman in silver was not offended by champagne, Claire. She was offended that you embarrassed her in front of people she wanted to impress. There are circles where that kind of embarrassment becomes a hobby. Questions get asked. Doors open. Private details become entertainment." I swallowed hard. How do you know that? Because those circles exist in my orbit. He said it without pride, without apology either. Just fact. I thought of the laughter under the chandelier, the way the woman had looked at me like I was a stain she intended to make permanent. My stomach tightened. So this is what? I lifted my hand, the diamond flashing between us like a small, expensive threat. Protection? Yes. It looks a lot like possession. For the first time that morning, something almost human crossed Adrian's face. Not softness. Something more dangerous than that. Honesty. In my world, he said quietly, the line between the two is often the first thing to disappear. Silence rushed in after that. Somewhere outside, a fountain splashed on the terrace. A plate clinked faintly in the next room. Inside me, fear and anger tangled so tightly I could not tell where one ended and the other began. I do not belong to your world, I said. No, Adrian answered. You do not. That is exactly why I needed the world to believe you belong to me. I stared at him. The arrogance of it should have made me walk out. Maybe it still would have, if not for the terrible logic buried inside his words. You cannot just decide something like that. I already did. The answer came fast, clean, and absolute. My heart pounded once, hard enough to hurt. I have a job, an apartment, a real life outside these walls. Then keep them, with your ring on my hand. For now. I shook my head, backing away from the table. You do not understand. Women like me do not wake up wearing rings from men like you and go back to normal. People ask questions. They make assumptions. Exactly. He took one step forward then, not aggressive, just deliberate. And right now, assumptions are safer than interest. I hated that part of me understood. Hated it even more when my voice came out quieter than before. How long? Adrian's eyes held mine. Long enough. It was not an answer. It was a wall. I looked down at the ring, then back at the man who had placed it there like he had every right to redraw the borders of my life while I slept. I never agreed to this, I whispered. His expression changed then, just slightly, enough to make my chest tighten. I know, he said. That is why I am standing here explaining instead of ordering. I should have felt relieved by that. Instead, the words settled into me like a warning dressed up as courtesy. Because men who knew how to order were always more frightening when they chose not to. I lifted my chin, trying to gather the pieces of myself that still felt like mine. Then explain one more thing. Adrian waited. How did you even know my ring size? For the first time since I walked into the room, the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile. Something quieter. More unsettling. I did not, he said. I guessed. The answer should not have mattered. A guess. Just a guess. But somehow that made everything worse, because it meant he had looked at my hands long enough to trust his own instinct, and men like Adrian Vale did not rely on instinct unless they expected the world to shape itself around them. I opened my mouth, closed it, then let out a breath that felt too thin for the room. That is not normal, I said. None of this is normal. No, Adrian replied. It is not. The simplicity of that agreement unsettled me more than argument would have. He was not trying to make this feel ordinary. He was asking me to step into something strange and accept that he had already measured the risk for both of us. I hated how close that came to sounding like care. I pulled out the chair across from him only because my knees had started to feel unreliable, then sat with my spine straight and my hands in my lap, as if posture alone could restore a little control. A server appeared almost instantly, as silent as a thought, and placed coffee near my right hand and a plate of fruit, eggs, and toast in front of me. I had not heard the door open, had not heard it close. That house moved around Adrian like a machine built to anticipate him. Eat, he said. I am not hungry. That would be more convincing if your hands were not shaking. I looked down and cursed internally. He was right. Again, I wrapped my fingers around the warm porcelain cup instead, letting the heat ground me. You notice too much. I notice what matters. The words hung there between us, heavy in a way I did not trust. I took one careful sip of coffee. It was perfect, of course. Dark, smooth, richer than anything I bought for myself on tired grocery runs after double shifts. So what now? I asked. Do I just go home pretending this is temporary while everyone in your world thinks I am? I glanced at the ring and could not finish the sentence. Adrian leaned one forearm lightly against the edge of the table. No one will approach you about it. That is not reassuring. It is meant to be. It sounds like a threat. It is a boundary. His gaze stayed on mine, unblinking and calm. There is a difference. I almost laughed at that, except something in me knew he believed it. Men like Adrian did not see themselves as cruel when they drew lines around other people. They saw themselves as efficient. Protective, if it suited them. Necessary, always. I cut a strawberry in half and set the fork down again without eating it. What happens when I leave here? A car will take you home. And then you go to work if you wish. You live your life. You answer no private questions. If anyone asks about the ring, you say it is personal. My brows lifted. That is your plan. For today. And tomorrow? Tomorrow depends on whether the message has been understood. The room fell quiet again. I looked past him to the rain-bright terrace and tried to picture my real apartment in Queens. The radiator that clanked all night. The chipped mug in my sink. The grocery list stuck to my refrigerator with a pizza delivery magnet. My life had always been small enough to carry in two hands. Rent, shifts, subway delays, careful budgeting, practical shoes. But a ring like this did not belong in that life. A man like Adrian definitely did not. You keep saying this is for my safety, I said slowly. But you still have not told me why you care. His expression changed so subtly, I might have imagined it if I had not been watching him so closely. Do I need a reason? Yes. The answer came too fast, too honest. Because men like you do not rearrange the world for women like me unless there is a reason. Adrian looked down at his coffee for the first time since I walked in, then back up. Last night, he said, you were humiliated in front of a room full of people who benefit from pretending kindness is weakness. You apologized for an accident. You kept your voice steady when you were hurting. You tried to protect your job instead of your pride. That tells me more about you than most people reveal in a year. My breath caught. He had been watching. Not just the aftermath. The whole thing. That still does not explain the ring. No, he said quietly. It explains why I could not ignore what happened after I saw it. Something in my chest shifted then, something small and disloyal. Not trust. Certainly not that. But maybe the dangerous beginning of understanding. I hated it on sight. You do not know me. Not yet. The words were soft. Controlled. Somehow more intimate for how careful they were not to become anything else. I looked away first. Outside, rain traced silver lines down the glass doors. Inside, the diamond on my hand caught the morning light again and sent it scattering across the tablecloth like a signal I did not know how to read. I want one thing clear, I said after a moment, my voice steadier now. This ring does not mean you own me. Adrian did not answer immediately. He studied me with that same impossible focus, as if the truth mattered enough to deserve precision. Claire, he said at last, if I wanted ownership, you would not be negotiating with me over breakfast. His words should have offended me more than they did. Maybe they would have, if he had said them with arrogance. But Adrian spoke the way some men handled knives, with so much control that the danger lived in the steadiness, not the edge. I looked at him across the breakfast table and hated the small, traitorous part of myself that felt calmer because of it. Not safe. I was not foolish enough to call it that. But calmer. As if the room had stopped tilting for one impossible second. I set my coffee cup down carefully and stood before that feeling could settle too deep. I want to go home. Adrian nodded once, like he had expected that from the beginning. You will. Today. Yes. Alone. His gaze rested on me for a beat too long. No, my heartbeat stumbled. That was not a suggestion. No, he said. It was not. I stared at him, anger rising hot and fast enough to steady me. Good. Anger I understood. Anger was useful. It reminded me where I ended and everyone else began. You do not get to assign me an escort like I am a problem to manage. Adrian pushed his chair back and stood, the movement quiet but absolute. At the moment, Claire, you are not the problem. You are the visible consequence of one. You keep speaking in riddles. I keep trying not to hand you more of my world than you need. Maybe I should decide what I need. Something changed in his face at that. Respect, maybe. Or the dangerous version of it. The kind, powerful men reserved for the few people willing to push back without trembling. Fair, he said. Then decide this. You can go home in one of my cars with security you will barely notice, or you can walk out alone wearing that ring and trust strangers to be harmless. I opened my mouth with 3 different arguments ready and lost all of them at once. Because that was the part one could not outrun. The ring. It gleamed on my hand in every possible reflection, a brilliant little betrayal. I hated that it had become real before I had even agreed to understand it. I could take it off, I said, though both of us knew I had already tried. Adrian's eyes dropped briefly to my left hand. Not yet. You make everything sound temporary, like that is supposed to comfort me. It is supposed to keep you moving. Before I could answer, a man in a dark suit appeared in the doorway. Mid-30s, maybe, with a posture so still it looked trained. He did not step fully into the room. Sir. Adrian turned slightly. What is it? There is a call from Hawthorne Catering. They are asking for Miss Bennett. My stomach dropped to my shoes. What? Adrian's expression did not change, but the air around him did. Sharper. More attentive. Put it through to the study, he said. I took one step forward. No. Put it through. To me. The man hesitated, only for a second, then glanced at Adrian. Adrian looked back at me. If they upset you again, the conversation ends. That is not your decision. Today it is. I laughed once, short and unbelieving. Do you hear yourself? Constantly. The answer came so dry I almost smiled, and the fact that I almost smiled at all felt like a personal betrayal. Adrian held out a hand toward the hall. Come with me. The study was darker than the breakfast room, lined wall to wall with books I doubted anyone was foolish enough to touch without permission. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. The phone sat waiting on a wide oak desk, speaker lit. Adrian did not sit behind it. He stood off to the side, one hand in his pocket, giving me room without leaving. I picked up the receiver and pressed it to my ear. This is Claire Bennett. There was a pause. Then my manager's voice, too bright in the way people sound when they are trying to be careful. Claire, there you are. We were trying to reach you. I know. I was given the message. My fingers tightened around the phone. Is everything okay? Another pause. Actually, yes. More than okay. Mr. Hawthorne personally asked me to tell you that there was a misunderstanding last night, and that your position is secure. I closed my eyes slowly. Adrian said nothing, but I could feel his attention from across the room like a second pulse. Secure, I repeated. Yes. In fact, he said you are being moved off event floor rotation for now. Private placement assignments only. Better hours. Better pay. My lips parted. What? My manager lowered her voice. Claire, I do not know what happened at that party, and I do not want to know. But someone very important made a call at around 6 this morning, and nobody at the company is asking questions. The room seemed to go completely still. I knew without turning that Adrian had not moved. I did not ask for special treatment, I said quietly. I know, my manager replied, sounding almost apologetic. But I would take the win if I were you. When the call ended, I set the receiver back in its cradle with more care than I felt. For a second, I just stood there staring at the dark wood desk, my own reflection faint in the glossy surface. Then I turned. Adrian was exactly where I left him. Calm. Controlled. Impossible. You called them. It was not a question. Yes. Without asking me. Yes. I took a step toward him before I could stop myself. You cannot keep changing my life every time you decide I need help. His eyes held mine, steady as rain against glass. Then stop needing help in rooms where I can see you. The words hit me hard enough to take my breath for a second, not because they were cruel, but because underneath them was the terrible truth that he had already seen too much. My embarrassment, my fear, my relief. The parts of me I usually kept folded small and private had become visible to him in less than 12 hours, and I did not know what frightened me more, that he had noticed or that he had responded. I do not know what to do with you, I whispered. Adrian's gaze dropped briefly to the ring, then lifted back to my face. That makes two of us, he said. For one suspended second, neither of us moved. Rain pressed softly against the study windows, the house around us humming with that strange, expensive quiet, and I stood there with my hand still half curled at my side, like I could somehow hide the ring from the truth it had already created. Adrian's last words stayed between us, low and dangerous in their honesty. That makes two of us. I should have said something sharp, something defensive, something that put distance back where it belonged. Instead, I looked at him and saw, for the first time since the pantry, something I had not been ready for. Not pity, not amusement, not the cold satisfaction of a man used to controlling outcomes. It was attention, stripped clean of performance. He had been watching me long before I realized it, and suddenly I needed to know why. When, I asked quietly, did you start noticing me? Adrian did not answer right away. He He turned his head slightly toward the rain-streaked glass, as if the weather had become unexpectedly interesting, then looked back at me with that same unbearable precision. Before last night, my pulse kicked once hard. That is not an answer. It is the first part of one. Then give me the rest. He was silent for a moment, and in that silence I became aware of everything. The weight of my own breathing, the faint scent of coffee and old leather in the room, the diamond on my hand catching pale morning light every time my fingers moved. Adrian stepped closer to the desk, but not to me, keeping the same careful distance he had held all morning, like he understood proximity was a language and was choosing each word deliberately. 3 months ago, he said, there was a winter fundraiser here. Different staff, different crowd. You were carrying 2 trays and trying to direct a florist who was about to put white lilies in the wrong room. I stared at him. The memory came back in fragments. A freezing evening in January. My coat left in the service entrance. The florist almost in tears because the event manager had changed the seating chart twice. I had fixed the flowers because nobody else would. You remember that? I asked. Yes. Why? Adrian's eyes held mine. Because everyone else in the room was performing importance, and you were the only person actually solving problems. The answer landed in my chest with a force I was not prepared for. I laughed once under my breath, but there was no humor in it, just disbelief. You noticed me because I moved flower arrangements? I noticed you because you were kind when no one had to be. My throat tightened. I looked away first, because something about hearing that from him felt more intimate than it should have. That still does not explain this, I said, lifting my hand slightly. No, Adrian said. It explains why I knew who you were before I asked for your name. I let that settle, and the more it settled, the stranger the morning became. He had not seen me once in a dramatic spotlight, not in some cinematic entrance, not even at my best. He had noticed me while I worked, while I fixed things that did not belong to me, while I tried to keep a room from falling apart around people wealthy enough not to care. There was something terrifying in being seen that clearly by a man like him. There was also something dangerously close to comforting. So what? I asked, forcing my voice steady. You have been keeping track of caterers now? The corner of. His mouth moved. It was barely there, but enough to change his whole face for a second. Only one. I should have hated the way that sounded. Instead, my stomach turned over with something warmer and far less welcome. I folded my arms as if that could protect me from my own reaction. That is not normal either. No, he said again, and this time there was something almost dry in his voice. You have made that point convincingly. A knock at the study door cut through the moment. One of the security men stepped in, posture straight, expression blank. Sir, the car is ready. Adrian nodded once. 5 minutes. The man withdrew without another word. I exhaled slowly, not realizing until then that part of me had been stalling. Going home had been all I wanted an hour ago. Now the idea of stepping back into my apartment with this ring on my hand and this conversation in my chest felt less like returning to normal and more like walking into a life that no longer fit the same way. Adrian seemed to read some piece of that on my face. Claire. His voice softened by half a degree, which on him felt seismic. You do not have to understand all of this today. That is convenient for you. Not particularly. I looked up at him. Then why does it feel like you are always 5 steps ahead of me? Because I have had more practice with impossible situations. And I am an impossible situation? For the first time, his answer came without pause. Yes. The honesty of it stole the air from the room. Not because it was cruel, because it was not. He said it like a fact he had already accepted. I looked down at the ring again, at the way the diamond flashed cool and bright against skin that still felt borrowed. I do not know what happens next, I admitted, so quietly I almost hoped he would not hear it. But of course he did. Adrian took one final step closer, stopping just inside the boundary that still left me room to breathe. Next, he said, you go home. His gaze dropped to my hand, then rose back to my face. And you keep the ring on until I know no one is brave enough to test what it means. The ride back to Queens felt shorter than it should have. Maybe because I spent most of it staring at my own hand in the tinted window and wondering how a single piece of jewelry had managed to turn the entire city into unfamiliar territory. Adrian's car was silent in the way expensive things often are, insulated from traffic, weather, and ordinary life. The driver never spoke. The man seated in the front passenger seat barely moved except to glance out at intersections with the calm alertness of someone who expected the world to behave badly if left unsupervised. I sat in the back alone, wrapped in a charcoal coat one of the house staff had pressed into my hands before I left, my apartment keys cold in my pocket, the ring catching weak afternoon light every time the car passed beneath an opening in the clouds. I should have felt relieved the moment we crossed into my neighborhood. Relief was what I had wanted all morning. My own block, my own building, my own stubborn radiator and cracked tile and grocery store on the corner with the flickering sign. Instead, dread settled heavier with every turn. Adrian had been right about one thing. Normal was gone. The car stopped outside my building just after 11. The security man in front got out first and opened my door before I could reach for the handle. "Miss Bennett," he said. Polite, respectful, infuriating. "I can manage," I muttered, stepping onto the sidewalk. The sky above Queens was the color of wet concrete, and a cold breeze slipped beneath my coat, carrying the smell of rain and traffic and street cart coffee. Home. I should have felt home. The security man only inclined his head. Of course, he did not follow me to the door, but I could feel both men watching until I was safely inside the building. The lobby smelled faintly like old mail and lemon cleaner. Mrs. Alvarez from 3B was standing by the bank of mailboxes in pink slippers and a robe patterned with faded sunflowers. She glanced up at the sound of the door, ready with her usual neighborly smile. Then she saw my coat. Then the car outside through the glass. Then, finally, the ring. Her eyebrows lifted so high I thought they might disappear into her hairline. "Claire Bennett," she said slowly, drawing out each syllable like she was testing a new flavor. Well, heat climbed up my neck. "Good morning, Mrs. Alvarez." She looked at my left hand again, and a small, delighted smile touched her mouth. "Looks like somebody had a very interesting night." I made a sound that might have been a laugh if my life were not actively collapsing. Something like that. Mercifully, the elevator opened before she could ask anything else. I escaped inside, pressing the button for the 5th floor with slightly shaky fingers. The metal doors slid shut, and my reflection stared back at me in the scratched paneling. Cream blouse, tailored slacks, hair brushed smooth by someone else's expensive guest suite. And that ring. I looked like a woman with answers. I did not even have stable footing. My apartment greeted me with the same stubborn honesty it always had. Narrow galley kitchen. Tiny table by the window. A stack of unopened coupons on the counter. A throw blanket half fallen off the couch where I had left it after my last 12-hour shift. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. I set my bag down and stood in the middle of the room, listening to the old radiator clink awake with a metallic groan. The sound should have comforted me. Instead, it made the silence around it feel louder. I walked to the bathroom and tried again to remove the ring. Soap. Cold water. A hand towel for grip. Nothing. It stayed exactly where Adrian had put it, bright and immovable, like a promise I had never made but could not seem to break. I braced both hands on the sink and stared at myself in the mirror. "This is temporary," I whispered. Temporary. The words sounded thin in my own voice. My phone buzzed on the counter, making me jump hard enough to knock over my toothbrush cup. I snatched it up, expecting a text from work or maybe an automated billing reminder. Instead, the screen showed an unknown number and a single message. "The car will remain outside until 6. Do not leave the building alone before then." No signature. None needed. I stared at the words until the letters blurred. Anger came first. Hot, immediate, familiar. He had sent me home and still found a way to stay in control of the edges. But underneath the anger was something colder. Because there had only been one way for him. To know that I would check my phone the moment I got inside. He had started learning my rhythms faster than I could defend them. I typed 3 different replies and deleted all of them. Finally, I locked the phone and tossed it onto the bed hard enough for the mattress to bounce. "Unbelievable," I muttered to the empty room. The room, unlike Adrian Vale, did not answer. I changed into jeans and an old college sweatshirt, hoping ordinary clothes would restore some ordinary feeling, but even that failed. The ring still flashed against faded cotton. The message still sat in my phone. The black car was still visible from my window, parked across the street with patient dark glass and too much purpose. By 2 in the afternoon, cabin fever had started crawling under my skin. I cleaned my kitchen, reorganized the spice cabinet, answered 2 emails, paid my electric bill. None of it helped. At 3:15, someone knocked on my door. My whole body went still. Not a neighbor's casual tap. Not the impatient thud of a delivery driver. 3 measured knocks. Precise. Certain. My pulse climbed into my throat. I moved quietly to the door and checked the peephole. A woman stood in the hall wearing a cream coat and heels too expensive for this building. Her blonde hair was perfectly arranged. Her lipstick was the same cool red as a stoplight. And even through warped apartment peephole glass, I recognized her immediately. The woman in silver from the party. She waited another 2 seconds, then leaned slightly toward the door. "Claire," she called, voice smooth as polished glass. "I think we should talk about your ring."